Welcome to Lesson 5.4, Understanding Authentication Systems. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Identity and Access Management domain. We are in Key Area of Knowledge B, which is Management, Identification, and Authentication of People and Devices. We are in C, which is Integrate Identity as a Service, and D, Integrate Third-Party Identification Services. Our topics will include Authentication Authorities, Single Sign-On, Kerberos, Sesame, Thin Clients, Federation Authentication, and Identity as a Service. Authentication authorities are systems that request, evaluate, and then either accept or reject authentication credentials. Remember, our authentication credentials could be something you know, something you have, something you are, or somewhere where you are. So our authentication authorities include local operating systems, application and databases with authentication mechanisms, single sign-on systems, SSO, Kerberos, Sesame, and thin client technologies, federated technologies, and identity as a service, IDaaS systems. Single sign-on systems allow the user to enter identification and authentication credentials one time and to then access all the resources in the primary and secondary security domains to which they've been granted access. For single sign-on systems to work, we need to have interoperability between resources. In a previous lesson, we referred to single sign-on as a legacy system because we said one of the problems was that we've really never had enterprises where every system could participate. But single sign-on does have a number of very viable applications. So we're going to be looking at some single sign-on systems, but be aware that the downside of a single sign-on system is a single point of failure. So Kerberos is the first single sign-on system we want to talk about. Kerberos is an open standard technology, and it's embedded in most operating systems where users must prove their identities to each application and service in a specific security domain. Kerberos is the de facto standard for heterogeneous environments. And after the initial authentication, Kerberos is completely transparent to the user. The core of a Kerberos system is a trusted third party called a Key Distribution Center, a KDC, which performs secure verification of the subjects. Kerberos uses AES, symmetric key cryptography, and tickets to convey authentication details. The Secure European Systems for Applications in a Multi-Vendor Environment, known as Sesame, is a single sign-on system designed to extend Kerberos functionality and to enhance security. Sesame uses both symmetric, remember shared key or single key, and asymmetric, remember key pair, public key, private key, based technologies to authenticate subjects. Sesame uses what's called a Privileged Attribute Certificate, or a PAC, which includes the subject's identity, their access capabilities, their access time period, and their lifetime. And a Privileged Attribute Server, known as a PAS, creates and digitally signs the PAC, which is a Privileged Attribute Certificate, on behalf of the user. Thin clients are another form of single sign-on, as the user only authenticates to the terminal or to the thin client server, which then provides access to all the available resources. So on behalf of the thin client, the server handles all resource requests, processing, and storage. In a federated authentication model, federated technologies facilitate the use of a single digital identity and credentials in multiple unrelated domains. The most visible use of federated technologies is on the web. Security Association Markup Language, SAML, is a platform-neutral, XML-based open standard format for exchanging authentication and authorization data between unrelated domain systems. OpenID is an open standard and a decentralized protocol that allows users to be authenticated by cooperating sites using a third-party service. So the difference between these two is with SAML, it's a way that systems can exchange authentication and authorization data. So they're exchanging between domains. OpenID doesn't exchange information. In an OpenID environment, the cooperating sites all agree to use the authentication mechanisms of a third-party service. Identity as a Service, IDaaS, is an emerging technology. IDaaS is described as a combination of administration and account provisioning, authentication, authorization, and reporting functions. But Identity as a Service is designed not just to work inside an organization, but also to support a whole variety of cloud-based applications. So let's review what we've discussed. We talked about the use of authentication authorities, single sign-on systems, single sign-on meaning that we provide our identification and our authentication credentials one time, and that allows us to get to multiple resources. We looked at Kerberos as the de facto standard in a heterogeneous environment. Kerberos relies on tickets to prove their identity once the user has been identified the first time by an authentication server. We discussed Sesame, which extends the functionality and security of Kerberos. We talked about thin clients and terminal services, and then the use of federation authentication, whether that's with SAML, which is the exchanging of authentication information, or OpenID, which is the reliance on a third party for authentication. And lastly, we looked at the emerging technology of Identity as a Service. So that brings us to Lesson 5.4, Match the Meaning. The terms you need to be familiar with: SPOF, that's a repeat, Kerberos, Sesame, Federation, SAML, IDaaS, and another repeat, SaaS. So put me on pause, take the time you need, match these up, come on back, and we'll go through them together. All right, let's try our lesson 5.4 terms. SPOF, that's our single point of failure. That's something that can stop an entire system from working. Kerberos is a ticket granting authentication service. After the user logs in, then a ticket is created, and that ticket is presented for access to other resources. Sesame uses that privileged attribute certificates to identify and authenticate the user. Federation is when we're using a single identity for unrelated domains. SAML is an XML standard for exchanging data. IDaaS is an emerging technology for subject management that's identity as a service. And lastly, SaaS, that stands for Software as a Service, and that's a cloud-based software. I hope you did great on this. We'll end this lesson as we always do with our CISSP exam tips. You want to remember that Kerberos uses tickets for authentication, that federated authentication is prominent on the web, and that a single sign-on system can potentially be a single point of failure. So thanks for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.